Hi, I'm Will the Gamer, and today I'm going to talk about dwarves. First things first, I'm going to talk about dwarven appearance. Dwarves are fairly short compared to average humans, ranging between 4 and 5 feet tall. They have 3 different skin tones, black, gray, and brown. The men have a generally bulky figure, while the women are more curvy. Naturally, all dwarves have white hair, but often dye it different colors, though in general they're going to resemble regular humans with more metallic shades of skin. Now before I go into deeper lore, I want to talk about their culture. While a dwarf may look like a human, they certainly do not act like one. Dwarves do not stop in a very literal sense. They are industrious to a fault, needing to constantly get something done. This has altered dwarven culture quite significantly. A dwarf will spend the majority of his time doing the following tasks: mining for precious stones and minerals which the dwarves covet, mastering his craft to turn those materials into something beautiful, and also spending time mastering the art of war. If they aren't doing any of those 3 things, they'll spend time in the mead hall. The mead hall, or the Great Hall, is the center of a dwarven city. The Great Hall is where the men and women of the hold come together to enjoy some good merriment. And by merriment I mean they drink their weight in mead and breed like rabbits. Since dwarven children are so small when they're born, it doesn't affect the lives of dwarven women. And since dwarven children are raised in groups and not by individual parents, this frees up the parents to go continue with merrymaking. As such, dwarves do not understand the concept of monogamous relationships. While a dwarf may favor a certain other dwarf, they won't always go straight back to that dwarf when they're merrymaking. This has affected the way dwarves elect their kings and their leaders. Instead of a monarchy based on a lineage, the kings and queens are elected by the people. Despite these traits, the dwarves have a very communal nature. They prefer the company of their fellow dwarves and have a strong camaraderie. Dwarves take the achievements of the individual as the achievements of all. As such, each dwarf offers their achievements to the greater whole of dwarf kind. So with that being said, let's get into dwarf history. The first major dwarf hold started popping up towards the beginning of the Age of Dragons. Protected from the constant onslaught of the dragons, they were able to carve out themselves giant underground empires. These solitary dwarf kingdoms would come together to form one massive dwarf empire towards the center of the Age of Dragons. At first, the only threat to the dwarves was the goblins, but they were so few and far between they posed little threat to the dwarven empire. However, as the dwarves began digging deeper and deeper, they found an enemy they could not defeat. The dwarves in their zealous digging had come across the Mulvar. The Mulvar are a lot like prairie dogs, with minor intelligence. Their claws and teeth are incredibly sharp, allowing them to dig through the earth very fast. They use this ability to cultivate massive tunnel farms to feed their populace. However, once the Mulvar realized they could add dwarves to their diet, they started pushing upwards. The dwarves had no defense against such enemies that could come at them from all sides, and were utterly crushed. This is impressive when you consider the fact that the dwarves of this time were capable of making the best weapons and armor of any age. Dwarven weapons and armor were made so well they last even to the modern day, and thus are coveted by many dwarves. That being said, they couldn't handle the sheer numbers of the Mulvar and were handed loss after loss. After centuries of crippling defeats, the dwarves were pushed all the way back to their individual dwarven kingdoms. However, they were too close to the surface for the Mulvar to feel comfortable. Direct sunlight is capable of burning out the eyes of a Mulvar. Thus, it became too difficult for the Mulvar to pursue the dwarves any farther and receded back into their tunnels. All these battles between the dwarves and the Mulvar would later be known as the War in the Dirt. The War in the Dirt ended roughly at the end of the Age of Dragons and the beginning of the Age of Orcs. The dwindled number of dwarves struggled against the constant orc threat. However, it was at this time that the gnomes appeared. Dwarves were not naturally magically inclined, and thus most of their weapons and armor would negate mana. However, the gnomes were incredibly powerful mages. They came and offered to work together with the dwarves in order to help defend against the orc threat. Gnomes also had magic which could fortify the walls of dwarven holds. This would protect new dwarven holds from Mulvar attacks. Using this new magic, they entered an age of expansion where they tried to get back their old empire. This began the Second War in the Dirt. The Second War in the Dirt lasted all the way until the First Age of the Empire. During this time, the dwarves and the gnomes attempted to push deeper. However, the double threat of the Molvar and the Orc raids proved too much for them. Thus, the dwarves were never really able to reclaim their old empire. When the elves and the fae came to make an alliance with the gnomes and the dwarves, they were quick to jump to it. This newly formed union vowed to take back the dwarven lands. The dwarven holds united at the new capital of Pendragon in order to forge a new empire. Here they would take on the roles of miners and metal workers in order to make the industry superpower that would eventually become the Empire. Though Pendragon was much farther from the Dwarven Empire than many were happy with, they eventually settled with making a new empire in order to reclaim their old one. Thus they forged their mighty capital city of Ironbore Hall. Digging downwards, they carved out giant square columns that would serve as housing, schools, and other necessities for the dwarves. At the base of each one of these different massive pillars was a dwarven great hall. However, the Empire's constant need for stone was great. Thus the dwarves needed to dig deeper and deeper to meet the Empire's needs. And just as before, they found their ancient enemy, the Molvar. However, before they found the Molvar again, they were already halfway through the Second Age of the Empire. This was the start of the Third War in the Dirt. Only this time, the dwarves were ready, with their elven, fae, human, and gnomish allies. Though many of the blacksmithing techniques were lost in the fall of the original Dwarven Empire, dwarven goods were still the best in the world. On top of that, the gnomes had brilliant minds and made great feats of engineering. When the Molvar finally came, they were completely outmatched. The dwarves had won their first victory against the Molvar. However, even though they had won, the Molvar were relentless. For every step the dwarves took forward into the caverns, the Molvar were there to make them take a step back. While the Molvar had been defeated in open combat, their numbers were still limitless. All the way to the present day of the lore, the Molvar have made the lives of dwarves miserable. After having been at war with the Molvar for so long, it became a rite of passage in dwarven society to kill one. So now that we're up to the present day, I can start expanding on the more details of dwarven culture. The dwarves in the modern day are separated into clans, each one of which having a specialization. While young dwarves are growing up, they're tested to see what skills they might have. Whatever skills they're best at is whatever clan they're sorted into, kind of like Hogwarts. There are 3 different clans: the Warriors clan, the Miners clan, and the Craftsmen's clan. They have specific names, but I'm not going to go into that now. Once a dwarves clan has been chosen, they will be in that clan for the rest of their life. There are only 2 ways for a dwarf to get out of his duties to the clan. The first is to rise to a political office. This can be within the dwarves or within the empire as a whole. And the second is to be chosen for imperial military service. Despite this, however, most dwarves are very content with their lives. They spend their lives doing what they're good at, drinking, and merrymaking. To some dwarves, this is paradise. However, there is always that odd dwarf that wants to see more of the world. Most of these dwarves that want to see the rest of the world will turn to imperial military service. However, there is one slightly more extreme way to go out and see the world, and that is for a dwarf to take the Oath of Reclamation. The Oath of Reclamation is basically a dwarf saying that they are going to go and reclaim an artifact from the old Dwarven Empire. The downside, however, is that they are not allowed to come back until they do. Sometimes the Oath of Reclamation is actually given as a punishment, sentencing evil dwarves to an almost certain death against the Molvar. However, any dwarf that comes back from an Oath of Reclamation with an artifact from the old Dwarven Empire is hailed as a hero. Now, as far as their role within the Empire, dwarves tend to keep to themselves and rarely leave their clan holds. This means that unless a dwarf is within the army, they are rarely seen by the other members of the Empire. Very rarely will more than one dwarf be on the Imperial Council, and the dwarf that is on the Imperial Council usually doesn't want to be there. However, Imperial law dictates that one of every race must be on the council at any given time. Besides that, only the dwarven merchants and traders will be seen outside the dwarven holds. Despite the primary religion of the Empire, dwarves also have a druidic society. Dwarven druids are often referred to as rock speakers. They play a strong role in the culture of dwarven lives, but they have little power in the greater Imperium. In fact, any religion besides the primary religion is seen as heresy. Thus the Dwarven Rock Speakers are passed off as geomancers. Though even if they were trying to pass as a religion, most of the Rock Speakers don't remember all of the details of their own religion. This is because much of their history had been lost during the fall of the Dwarven Empire. Among the things lost were the vast murals describing their religion. Thus all of the religion that remains was passed orally from dwarf to dwarf, though even the greatest among them admit that there are many holes within their doctrine. Anyways, that's all I can think about as far as dwarven lore goes for the moment. If you have any specific questions about dwarves, just let me know and I'll answer them in the comments below. Now I'll move on to their race-specific abilities and available classes. First of all, the available dwarven classes. The available dwarven classes are Druid, Acolyte, Warrior, and Archer. Their race-specific bonuses are as follows. Adept Miners, a 10% chance to get double whatever mineral you're mining. Master Blacksmiths, all results are 10% better than they should have been. For instance, if you only got 90% on your blacksmithing minigame, it would just up it to 100. It doesn't go past 100 though. Their third passive is called Legend of the Rock Speakers and gives them a 5% bonus to all geomancy damage. Their fourth passive is the Skin of Iron, which gives them a 10% armor bonus. And their fifth passive is Love of Hammers and Axes, which gives them a 5% damage bonus when, of course, they're using hammers and axes. This is exclusive to weapon damage, I should say. Now, I am extremely tired, and I can't think of anything else to talk about in this particular video, so like I said earlier, make sure to leave a comment if you have any other questions about dwarves, and I will be sure to answer them. So for now, I'm Will the Gamer, thanks for watching.